is Indian Country Today.
Eskwili, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Here are the headlines for Tuesday, November 3rd. Native Americans and Alaska Native voters are showing an increasing power to determine the next president. And overall, Native voters stand to play a crucial role in the 2020 election. This especially is true in swing states where they make up significant portions of the eligible voter population. States where two major parties have similar levels of support and high numbers of electoral votes are also home to large Native populations. About 3.7 million American Indians and Alaska Natives are of voting age. And this election, all eyes are on battleground states such as Alaska, Arizona, and Minnesota. We will bring you the results of the Native vote as we continue to cover this election. After waiting for 70 years, the grandmothers will have to wait at least another 2 weeks. That's the latest in Rapid City, South Dakota. The city council put off voting on a land swap proposal last night. It would address land claims from the closure of the Rapid City boarding school. Stuart Huntington was there and brings us this report.
More than 30 people spoke up Monday night to show their support for a plan to clean up some questionable deeds and possibly grant Lakota citizens some benefit from old Rapid City Indian boarding school land that leaders and grandmothers have been demanding for decades. Bree Jackson told how her grandmother was forced to live in substandard conditions.
I think it's easy to think of these travesties as happening in a distant past. That mindset makes it easier to remain stagnant. However, my grandma's stories are a reminder that this history is not so distant. I would like to urge you tonight to pass the land swap resolution as an act of good faith to the Native American community.
And Mayor Steve Allender made an impassioned pitch.
Where's the evidence in Rapid City that this government body and the citizens of Rapid City have invested into the Native American community? Where are those things that have primarily benefited the Native American community? And the answer is they're not really there.
The issue dates to a 1948 act of Congress that doled out 1,200 acres of Rapid City Indian boarding school land. None of the land has ever gone to natives, despite 70 years of pleas. 5 years ago, researchers found 3 properties that were not distributed according to the law. They argued that the parcels should revert back to federal ownership. The BIA agreed in a 2017 memo. It appears the analysis is correct. 3 parcels would now be subject to reversion. Also endorsed was a creative solution that helps rectify deed violations and this historical imbalance. Work in this vein yielded the resolution before the council that was sent on a 6-3 vote off for more study. The move left some observers optimistic and yet still impatient.
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that it will happen. I don't understand the gentlemen who had the chance to do their homework prior to this meeting and then come to the meeting saying they still had questions.
Well, I think some people might be frustrated. Their patience is growing thin with this, but no one tonight said that they were against it.
In Rapid City, Stuart Huntington, Indian Country Today.
The City Council will mull the land swap details some more on November 10th and possibly bring the resolution to a vote at its next full meeting on November 16th, and we will bring you that update. U.S. Representative Deb Haaland and Senator Elizabeth Warren are condemning the censorship of a report on the pandemic's impact on tribal nations. Members of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights voted to withhold critical information about COVID-19. Senator Warren and Representative Haaland released a joint statement criticizing the Republican appointees who blocked publication of the updates in the Broken Promises report. Back in May, both members of Congress asked the commission to update the landmark report. Catherine Lehman, the commission chair, said the investigation uncovered staggering needs, including sky-high hospitalization rates and limited supplies and resources. Oprah Magazine is naming 31 Native American authors to read right now. One of the writers is Alisa Washita, who is Cowlitz, and is thrilled to be included on this list.
It was just amazing company to be in with my peers, with writers who came before me who I really admire. And of course, you know, tons of peers I admire and learn from so much.
Washita compiled her own list with more than 200 Native writers, and you can see her list on bookshop.org. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today for Tuesday, November 3rd. I'm Patty Thalahungva. As the ballots are being counted and the winners are being named, some might say the easy part is over. Now those newly elected leaders need to do just that, lead. How can they do that effectively? Well, the Native Governance Center, based in St. Paul, Minnesota, offers classes for newly elected tribal leaders on tribal governance support, leadership development, and community engagement. Wayne Ducheneaux is the executive director of the Native Governance Center, and he is enrolled in the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and worked for his tribe overseeing some enterprises. He also served a 2-year term as the vice chairman. He joins us today to talk about what the newly elected leaders can expect when they take office. Welcome, Wayne.
Thanks, Patty. How mitakepi? Chante washte na pe chiuzapielo, Wayne Ducheneaux in Makichapi. Hello, my relatives. I greet you all with a good heart and a handshake. My name is Wayne Ducheneaux. Again, thanks for letting me be here today.
Absolutely. It is election day here in the United States. What is the one piece of advice that you give to every newly elected leader who comes through your program?
I think the best piece of advice that we impart on our elected leaders are the ideas of these Native Nation rebuilding principles that is born out of the work of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. 40 years of research that boils down that tribes that exemplify these 5 things or these 5 practices are going to have generally more success. And that's spirited leadership, capable governing institutions, having a strategic orientation, always relating it back and having a cultural match, and then exercising their sovereignty practically. So with those nation building tenets in mind, we really try to impart that lesson with the tribal leaders so that they can go in and really help their tribal nations improve.
So it's really important to help these newly elected leaders understand, how do they govern in their term here. And in the 5 years you've been around and holding these classes, what are some of the things that the leaders have taught you?
It's about being patient and having some opportunity to understand. Tribal leaders are like no other elected leader in the nation. Our tribal leaders have to spend some time being part legislator, sometimes administering programs or enterprise. They also have to be responsible directly to their constituents who happen to be most oftentimes their family. And so, I defy you to find another elected leader in the nation who has to be as responsive to their constituency as a tribal leader. For instance, they have to be able to fly to Washington, D.C. and negotiate with federal administration or congressional folks on bills or policy enactment. They then have to be able to come home and sometimes get down to the granular level of making sure grandma has propane or wood for their fire for the winter, right? And so I don't think you find another elected leader across the country that is as responsive or more responsible to their constituents than an elected tribal leader. And so what they've taught me is you have to be well-rounded. You have to understand things from a local, regional, and a national level in order to do your job right.
It's so true. There's a saying that all politics is local, and in Indian country, that's even hyper-local, would you say?
I agree. It's one of those things like there is nothing quite as exhilarating and even parts dangerous when you have to tell your auntie, no, I can't do that for you, right? But because we have to do things following our policy, following our procedures, following our laws, you tend to get scolded a little bit more than I imagine in a more personal way than, let's say, a congressional representative for a state or a governor.
Wow. Well, that's really bringing it home here. So, in this election, of course, tribal leaders are taught through your courses how to be a better leader. Let's branch that out to working with tribally elected leaders, because you touched on that briefly, but truly, the understanding of federal Indian law, what is that, and how does that play a part when it comes to being a good leader and giving a better understanding to non-natives about the jurisdictional issues, all of that entails?
Yep. Federal Indian law, right, is what we've extrapolated out from time immemorial in regard to tribal nations and their relationship with the federal government, right? And those first started with treaties back in the day. And for every succeeding act after a treaty, you have what now is embodied in federal Indian law. And federal Indian law is really something that everybody in this country should be familiar with. They should understand. It really holds the federal government to their trust responsibility in one way, shape, or form. And for newly elected tribal leaders and for just tribal or elected leaders in general, fully understanding the United States responsibility to Indian country is really important. And the way you do that is through federal Indian law. It's the same for local and state officials, making sure that they understand tribes are sovereign nations, that they have laws that supersede your local and state laws in some instances. So having a good fundamental understanding of federal Indian law as it relates directly to non-Indian relationships is going to be important for elected leaders across the country, and something that honestly should be taught more frequently as a part of staple education, K through 12, post high school and collegiate, and for advanced degrees.
And that's certainly the case when it comes to education and the teaching of federal Indian law in the at the high school level. You learn, state government, you learn federal government, but federal Indian law government is not taught. And yet we see it in cases where there are states with large Native American populations where those elected leaders have to learn and have now understood in some cases what those jurisdictional issues involve. And so this summer we had the case in South Dakota where the governor there wanted to take down road barricades that the tribes had set up. And they said, no, we have our treaty right to put up these barricades to keep people out, to hopefully stop the spread of COVID-19.
One of the tribes in particular in South Dakota is my home tribe, the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. And we didn't call them road barricades. They're safety checkpoints. They're no more inconvenient to folks than sitting through a construction wait, at the checkpoints when you come to a construction zone. And so I just want to make sure to highlight and articulate that difference. It's one of those things that you're absolutely right. The reasoning behind that was grounded in not only the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, where we have a responsibility as a tribe, not only to our tribal citizens, but to residents of the reservation to protect their health and general welfare. That is one of those instances where that has been walked forward through our tribal constitution. And actually in our tribal constitution at Cheyenne River, we do have an obligation to ensure that we are, again, looking out. We brought that treaty obligation forward for our tribe to not only make sure we're taking care of our tribal citizens, but the non-citizen residents of our reservation. And so, and again, to reinforce, you did have a very basic misunderstanding at the state level as to, what is the tribe's authority in this instance, right? Easements were brought up in that discussion, and really none of that had anything to bear. There are Supreme Court cases, there is founded law in Rosebud v. South Dakota that really articulates the tribes have every right and responsibility to be able to do things like set up health checkpoints to ensure that COVID-19 wasn't infiltrating our reservations. A lot of tribes in South Dakota started that early on, and is the main reason you saw them not be hotspots quite as quickly as other places within the state.
And thank you for that clarification. So yes, absolutely, health checkpoints. And all of that, again, in this pandemic, it's really showing how there's so many disparities, but the steps were taken because the lack of health care in that area there.
It was really amazing to have that group of state legislatures send a signed letter up to our governor, kind of explaining to her Indian Country 101, in this instance, that they understood as state legislators their responsibility to support the tribe in this endeavor. It's quite unfortunate that that wasn't told or really held to, but the tribes have held strong, and like we've now see, many of our tribes in the state are still holding strong. Yeah.
Well, and then we go to Oklahoma, where the McGirt versus Oklahoma Supreme Court case has really made a lot of the state lawmakers, they're very nervous, and now they're appealing to overturn some of that decision. And again, not understanding the jurisdictional issues, it appears.
And that's the thing, I think if local and state governments would take the time to understand that tribal nations are only doing their constitutional duties the same as they are, I think rather than looking to spoil for a fight immediately, they would look to try to find partnership and move things forward together. There are many great examples in Indian country. Oftentimes we focus solely on the fights that we have between tribes and local governments, between tribes and state governments, but there are countless examples of when tribes, local and state officials come together to work on issues, great solutions can come about. And the thing that's exciting about McGirt and kind of federal Indian law in general is it's quite cutting edge. The precedent is from hundreds, tens of hundreds of years ago sometimes in some instances, but the cutting edge of the way it applies today is always new and ever changing. And so McGirt really lays bare the understanding that congressional precedence in this instance really is at the root and the responsibility. And I'm heartened to see that the tribes in Oklahoma are really taking this matter seriously. After the case and the decision was handed down, conversation started almost immediately with the state government about what does this mean and how are we going to move forward. You have seen some posturing from both sides, but what I hoped that comes out of it, something that is really great that come out of it, is a new imagination of what tribal-state relations can be for the state of Oklahoma and how they can move things forward together. There are many advantages when states work with tribal nations, and the vice versa. There are many advantages for tribes when they work with state and local governments to ensure prosperity for all.
And then, a lot's made of the person's first 100 days in office. What can you expect to accomplish? How is that philosophy? Does it align with Native philosophy when it comes to leadership, or how does it differ?
I think most tribal leaders understand that in this indigenous mindset that we have this 7th generation philosophy, right? Where the decisions we make today are responsible out to the next 7 generations. But I had a great mentor in my life, Regis Pecos from the Southwest, who he says he kind of contemplates and contextualizes the 7 generations a little different. He takes a look at it from you being the middle of the 7 generations, and you have your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents behind you. You have your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren in front of you, right? And so indigenous folks, when we're taking a look and contemplating just what is our mission, what do we have to do once we get into elected office, it's grounded in either one of those perspectives about 7 generations. And it really helps us to be more thoughtful, forward thinking, understanding that there's a lot more at stake than just making sure that we can be elected in the next 2 years or 4 years or however long our term may be.
But that's hard to resist, because especially for a Congress, they get elected and then immediately it seems like they're starting to campaign because they're elected for 2 years. That's
true. But you'll often notice that those folks in Congress that have longevity, the ones that are serving 3, 4, 5, 10, multiple year terms, their message is about future and it's about forward planning. It's having that strategic orientation. It's ensuring that the promises that they make, the stands that they take, that they're always continually working to fulfill and progress towards. Oftentimes it's not going to happen in that 2 years. The other thing they do great is community engagement. They talk with their constituents. They help them understand that, change doesn't happen overnight. Like it or lump it, this democracy is over, 100 years, 150 years old right now. I can't even remember how long it is since the founding of this country. But Indian nations are even older in time than that, right? And so when we think about how you make decisions, how it affects those things, really those leaders that have longevity are the ones that can make that case that it's going to take more than just 2 years to make change. And before colonization, so many tribes were matrilineal. It was very natural to have women as leaders. And we're finally starting to see that in Congress. The number of even just Native women running for offices, Congress, and also state offices nationwide is more than the number of men running. I think it's like a 66 to 44 ratio here. So we're really seeing Native women step up and run for these offices. And again, whether it's at the state level or the national level. And as you've seen tribes evolve out of our colonial mindsets, right? Many of our tribal nations had Indian Reorganization Act constitutions foisted upon us. As we return to what is traditional with us in our governance structures and our leadership ways, you are seeing women, Native women, come out more and more often and understand that not only historically was their role and responsibility to be leaders for their tribal nations, but now in the modern contextual time, it is also their responsibility to step up and lead. And I, for one, am, was so heartened and so glad when we saw Sharice and Deb get in, Congresswoman Davids and Congresswoman Holland, when we saw Lieutenant Governor Flanagan in Minnesota rise to the highest statewide office for a Native American woman in this country. It really shows that, as we as Indigenous people return to our culture, return to our values, the value that is women is going to be one thing that helps us move forward. And it's also that Indigenous wisdom to this land, right? So democracy is Indigenous. And you mentioned something briefly there too, and that's the environment. And yet in this election, we haven't heard a lot about the environment. When it comes to leaders and addressing issues regarding the environment, what advice do you have? Because, we've got this controversy between coal power and solar power and other forms of power.
and we have climate change that's here.
I think it's really summed up very easily. It's mini Wachoni, water is life. We as, all people have to start putting the environment and nature and the natural world forward, understanding that without it, we're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. When you have methane reserves in the Arctic North releasing, which is going to cause emissions into the ozone like we haven't seen before. Those things we have to, as a people, start thinking seriously in that seventh generational mindset. How are the lessons what are we going to do today to enact and make sure that we're keeping this environment safe for our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren?
Last thought on leadership and your best advice to these newly elected leaders. And some of them will know, immediately, but some of them it'll take a couple of days or maybe in a few weeks before we find out the results, which is normal. But what is your best advice for these new leaders?
Understand that you don't know everything. Be humble and ask questions. It's your responsibility to make sure you're doing everything you can to be the best leader you can. Do that by talking with people and asking questions.
Great. Well, we want to thank you, Wayne Ducheneaux, the Executive Director of the Native Governance Center. Thanks so much for joining us.
Wopulatonka. Great, thanks. Thank you.
And when we come back, imagine having to drive more than 70 miles to vote. That's the reality of many Native Americans on reservations. We'll visit the Hopi Reservation in northern Arizona when we come back.
This is Indian Country Today.
The term voter suppression can take many forms. Consider Arizona, a key swing state in this election year. Native Americans only won the right to vote in that state 72 years ago. Now they make up 6% of the eligible voters in Arizona, which is enough to make the difference. That is, if they can make it to the polls. We partnered with the news program Matter of Fact with Soledad O'Brien and the Economic Hardship Reporting Project on this story to see what challenges voters on the Hopi Reservation face.
The barriers we face here on the reservation are, I'm sure, different to other communities out there. Lomatalangwa ne Mark talayam tiwayan pahan matiwa.
Nakwalangwa talaspensi hopi matiwa. Nekwantalawa talasemanayan hopi matiwa.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Banemptiwa.
My name is Orion Duani. I am from Kikoksmovie, Arizona.
There's a lot of disparities that create unique challenges for places like here on Hopi that's rural. We have 12 villages here on the Hopi Nation, which covers a span area of 1.5 million acres. And they're spread across 3 mesas.
This building here is what is normally our elderly and community youth center. As you see, there's no signages indicating it is a polling site, but come election day, that will be all brought and that will be posted that this will serve as a polling site.
There's a lot of people who don't have transportation out here, and out here on the reservation we don't have public transportation.
The area out here, we're so spread out, and during this pandemic, not being able to all be together and talk about these issues, I think is a holdup for what's going on right now with the election coming up.
You are listening to KUYI 88.1 FM, licensed in Hopevilla, transmitting to Hopi land.
From here, it's about 60 to 70 miles to get to Tiba. It's the shortest distance for me to vote.
The reservation is very vast, and across that stretch of land, which is our reservation, we have 5 post offices.
Part of the challenge in this year's election, there's been no education to the community about where to get registered to vote, how to go register to vote.
A lot of it is online now, and then not a lot of the elders are able to access that information readily.
People who I've grown up with, I'm sure are not aware that we recently got our rights to vote.
So that was one of the things that historically has been taken from a lot of tribes is really their right to be heard.
We are considered a minority. The tribal nations across the U.S. And in Arizona, but I believe we could have a huge impact.
And I just wanted to encourage everyone out there to vote. Get out there and voice your vote.
Indian Country Today is following the races of more than 100 Native American candidates running for office. You can follow our coverage this week as we bring you the results of Election 2020. Who will lead our country for the next 4 years? How will this election impact and shape Indian Country? We'll ask the newly elected leaders as we continue to cover the Native vote. And that will do it for this edition of Indian Country Today. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thalahungva. We'll see you again tomorrow.
You got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.